The pianist who called Freddie Mercury not real and regretted it 3 hours later. A recording studio in London, 1977. Freddie Mercury sat at the piano running through chord progressions for what would become one of Queen's most complex arrangements. Across the room, a classically trained pianist invited to observe the session stood with arms crossed, listening with the kind of analytical detachment that comes from decades of conservatory training. Then he said it, not loudly, not with malice, just clearly enough for everyone to hear. Extraordinary performer, but he's not a real pianist. The room went cold, not because anyone shouted or argued, but because the people who actually knew Freddie Mercury understood something that visiting pianist was about to learn the hard way. You could question Freddie's outfits. You could question his theatrical choices. You could question anything except his musicianship. Because what happened in the next 3 hours would permanently change that pianist's understanding of what real musicianship looked like. And by the end of that evening, he would walk up to Freddie, extend his hand, and quietly admit, "I misjudged you completely." This is the story of the day Freddie Mercury reminded everyone that the man commanding stadiums had built his empire on piano keys, not just stage presence, and why the greatest response to doubt is never an argument, it's a demonstration. By the mid-1970s, Queen had developed a reputation that cut two ways. To millions of fans, they were revolutionary complex harmonies, theatrical productions, songs that defied radio formats and succeeded anyway. But to certain corners of the music establishment, especially classically trained musicians, Queen was spectacle over substance. Too polished, too dramatic, too much flash-hiding insufficient foundation. Freddie Mercury bore the brunt of this skepticism. His flamboyant stage presence, his costumes, his commanding physicality, all of it created an impression that the showmanship was compensating for something, that underneath the swagger was a performer rather than a musician. It didn't matter that Killer Queen had been built around intricate piano work. It didn't matter that Bohemian Rhapsody started with Freddie's fingers on ivory keys, constructing something that would require an orchestra's worth of overdubs to complete. To skeptics, those accomplishments were studio magic, production tricks, the work of engineers rather than the artist himself. This perception followed Queen into that studio session in late 1977. They were deep into recording their sixth album, working under the pressure that comes with following massive success. The visiting pianist had been invited by someone at the label not to collaborate, just to observe. Industry courtesy, professional networking, nothing more. He watched the session with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life evaluating technique. Watched Freddie move around the studio, throwing out ideas, humming melodies, occasionally sitting at the piano to demonstrate a phrase. Watched with the quiet confidence of someone convinced he knew exactly what he was seeing, and then he made his assessment, spoke it like a professional opinion rather than an insult, which somehow made it worse. Extraordinary performer, but he's not a real pianist. Brian May noticed Freddie's reaction immediately. Not anger, something more calculated. Freddie didn't stop what he was doing, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the comment at all, just continued adjusting something on the mixing board as if he hadn't heard. But everyone who knew him recognized that particular stillness. It meant Freddie was processing, deciding how to respond, calibrating his next move with the same precision he brought to vocal harmonies. After a moment, he walked to the grand piano in the corner of Studio A, pulled the bench closer, rolled his shoulders like an athlete preparing for competition. The room went silent. Even the engineer stopped adjusting levels because everyone recognized what was about to happen. Freddie wasn't going to argue. He was going to demonstrate, and demonstrations, when done correctly, don't leave room for interpretation. What made the next moment so unsettling was that Freddie didn't start with something flashy. That would have been expected, easy to dismiss as showing off. Instead, he began with something deceptively simple, a delicate classical progression, clean voicing, precise timing, no theatrical gestures, no exaggerated movements, just control. The visiting pianist's posture changed slightly, leaned forward, because this wasn't what he'd anticipated. Freddie's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, transitioning into a variation that felt like Chopin filtered through rock sensibility. There was tension in the left hand, unexpected melodic turns in the right. This wasn't technical showboating, it was compositional intelligence. He shifted seamlessly into an early version of what would become the operatic section of Bohemian Rhapsody. The chord transitions were unconventional, the structure unpredictable, but the execution was confident, assured. The work of someone who understood not just how to play notes, but how to construct emotion through harmony. Brian would later say that what made Freddie dangerous wasn't just skill, it was instinct. He understood drama musically, not just visually, could sense where tension needed to build, where release needed to happen, how to make a progression feel inevitable even when it was completely unexpected. The room, moments earlier filled with quiet skepticism, now felt charged with something else. Recognition, maybe, or reassessment. Freddie closed his eyes and pushed further. Tempo change, dynamic swell, harmonic twist that shouldn't have worked but did. The pianist's arms uncrossed, head tilted, because this wasn't about whether Freddie could play anymore. It was about how badly he'd miscalculated. And Freddie wasn't finished, not even close. There's a specific kind of silence that settles over recording studios during certain moments. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of doubt. That's what filled the room as Freddie's playing became more assertive. Not louder, not faster, just more intentional. He introduced syncopated rhythms beneath melodic lines that shouldn't have worked together, but locked perfectly. Complex polyrhythms that required both hands operating almost independently while serving the same emotional purpose. Brian watched the visiting pianist carefully. The polite detachment had completely disappeared. In its place was focus, the kind of attention you give when you're learning something rather than evaluating it. Freddie transitioned into a full run-through of Somebody to Love, just voice and piano. No backing harmonies, no layered vocals, raw and exposed. This was where weaknesses would show if they existed. He hit a high note mid-phrase without breaking the rhythm in his left hand. The coordination alone required discipline that most casual players never develop. Right hand carrying melody while left maintained harmonic structure, while voice added a third completely independent element. When he finished the passage, he didn't look around for approval. Just let the final chord ring out, sustaining until it faded naturally into silence. The pianist cleared his throat. No grand apology, no dramatic admission, just a quiet nod. But in creative spaces, nods carry weight. That small gesture acknowledged what words would have made awkward. He'd been wrong. Freddie stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and walked past the pianist without saying anything at all. Brian remembers thinking something very clearly in that moment. Freddie never needed to prove he was a pianist. He only needed to remind people when they forgot. But that wasn't the end of it. Because what happened later that evening sealed something permanent. That night didn't end with the quiet nod. Freddie wasn't interested in winning a private moment. He wanted something deeper validation through creation. After most of the crew had left, he returned to the piano. Brian stayed. So did Roger, half curious about what Freddie was working through, half amused at how the earlier tension had shifted the session's entire energy. Freddie sat down again. But this time there was no audience to impress. He began dissecting one of the more complex arrangements they'd been developing, slowing it down, rebuilding it, testing alternative harmonies. What struck Brian wasn't just the playing, it was the ear. Freddie would pause mid-phrase, adjust a chord by a single note, and suddenly the entire emotional temperature of the piece would transform. "That one breathes better," Freddie murmured once, almost to himself. "That's not something a showman says. That's what a composer says." He ran through variations of what would evolve into the dramatic piano sections Queen became known for. Those dynamic swells, unexpected modulations, tension and release structures that made their songs feel like miniature operas. He wasn't performing. He was engineering emotion. And in that quiet studio, stripped of lights and costumes and audience, Freddie revealed something far more intimidating than charisma: absolute control. Brian realized something important watching this. People didn't underestimate Freddie because he lacked skill. They underestimated him because he made it look effortless. But effortlessness in music is usually the result of obsession, and Freddie was obsessed. The true proof, however, wouldn't happen in the studio. It would happen under lights, in front of thousands, where mistakes couldn't be hidden. 3 weeks later, Queen performed at a packed venue in Europe. The energy was different from a controlled recording space, louder, less forgiving. If Freddie's playing had weaknesses, live performance would expose them. He walked toward the piano with his familiar confidence. But Brian knew better. Confidence doesn't mean casual, it means prepared. The first chords rang out crisp, deliberate, commanding. No backing track to hide behind, no safety net of studio production. Just Freddie and the instrument. As the song progressed, he layered vocal runs over intricate piano patterns. The coordination demanded discipline, right hand carrying melody, left maintaining harmonic foundation, voice adding emotional peaks, all while maintaining perfect timing. He shifted dynamics mid-phrase, leaning into crescendos without overpowering the keys or losing the melody's shape. The audience was locked in, but more importantly, so were the critics scattered through the press section. Freddie wasn't just keeping time. He was leading the band from the piano, dictating tempo changes with subtle shifts in touch, signaling dynamics through his playing before anyone else moved. At one point, he stood during a sustained vocal passage, letting the piano carry momentum without him. Showmanship, yes, but also mastery, because only someone confident in their foundation can step away knowing the structure won't collapse. Brian glanced toward the wings and saw something that confirmed everything. The visiting pianist from weeks before stood there watching, arms no longer crossed, expression no longer skeptical, just attentive. And that's when Brian understood something crucial. Freddie didn't silence people with arguments. He silenced them with performance. But the final confirmation came later, in a place no spotlight could reach. After the show, backstage corridors buzzed with usual chaos, crew members shouting, instruments being packed, adrenaline still thick in the air. Freddie moved through it calmly, towel draped over shoulders. Then the pianist approached him. No audience now, no stage, no performance to hide behind, just two musicians. Brian watched from a distance as the pianist extended his hand. Freddie shook it. There was a brief exchange, quiet enough that Brian couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough. "I misjudged you," the pianist admitted softly. Freddie smiled, not triumphantly, not smugly, just knowingly. "I get that a lot," he replied. Then, in typical fashion, added something disarming. "Being underestimated is rather useful, actually." That was Freddie. He understood perception better than most. New people saw the costumes, the mustache, the drama, and assumed substance was secondary. He let them think that because it made moments like this more powerful. Brian would later say that Freddie's greatest weapon wasn't his voice or his piano or even his stage presence. It was his refusal to be confined to one dimension. Most artists would have corrected the misperception immediately, would have granted interviews, listed credentials, cited influences, explained their training in defensive detail. Freddie never did. And that wasn't accidental. He understood something many musicians never grasp. The public loves a simple narrative. Showman, flamboyant, over the top. Those labels were digestible, easy to repeat. Freddie let them exist because they distracted from something far more dangerous, his discipline. Brian often said Freddie worked harder than anyone in the band. Hours at the piano refining phrasing, reworking chord inversions, testing vocal piano synchronization until it felt instinctive. But the public didn't see the repetition. They saw the explosion. And Freddie preferred it that way because when you allow people to underestimate you, you control the reveal. Every time he sat at the piano and delivered something precise and emotionally devastating, the contrast became his advantage. Brian began noticing a pattern over the years. Freddie thrived on skepticism, not because he needed to prove something, but because proving people wrong gave him energy. He didn't resent being misjudged. He weaponized it, and the world would see the ultimate version of that weapon on a much bigger stage years later. The moment that permanently shattered the just a showman narrative didn't happen in a studio. It happened in front of 72,000 people under daylight with nowhere to hide. Live Aid, 1985. By then, Freddie's reputation as an unmatched frontman was cemented, but there were still whispers that Queen's precision came from studio layering, that their complex arrangements wouldn't survive raw performance conditions. They were catastrophically wrong, Freddie walked to the piano at Wembley Stadium with complete command. No elaborate lighting tricks yet, it was still daylight. No production cushion, just an instrument and a microphone. He opened with deliberate clarity. Chords struck cleanly, timing sharp, transitions fluid. Then came the vocal layering, recreated live through dynamic control and rhythmic precision rather than studio magic. What stunned Brian wasn't the crowd reaction, it was the technical steadiness. Freddie maintained perfect pitch while driving tempo changes, leaned into crescendos without overpowering the harmonic bass. His left hand kept structural foundation while his right introduced melodic tension. This wasn't chaos pretending to be control. This was architecture. And when he stood mid-song to command the audience in the now legendary call and response, it didn't weaken the piano line. It elevated it because the foundation had already been laid. That was the difference between spectacle and substance. Spectacle distracts. Substance sustains. Freddie had both. After Live Aid, the conversation shifted permanently. It stopped being about whether he was real and became about whether anyone else could match him. More often than not, the answer was silence. Years later, when Brian reflects on that studio comment from 1977, he doesn't feel anger. He feels clarity. Because that moment taught him something about Freddie he hadn't fully grasped before. Freddie didn't need to choose between being a showman and being a musician. He rejected the entire premise that those roles were separate. To Freddie, the piano wasn't an accessory. It was a weapon. The stage wasn't a distraction. It was an amplifier. Brian realized that many classically trained musicians valued restraint, purity, technical display for its own sake. Freddie valued impact. He wasn't interested in impressing other pianists. He was interested in moving audiences. And the irony? That required even greater control. Because to make something look effortless in front of thousands, you must master it privately first. The visiting pianist had been evaluating technique. Freddie had been operating on a different scale entirely. And that's why the misunderstanding happened. The comment, "just a showman," was never truly about piano. It was about perception. Freddie blurred categories, blurred expectations, blurred boundaries between discipline and drama. And when you blur boundaries, people get uncomfortable until you prove it works. Freddie did, over and over. Not with arguments or interviews, but with performance. That's the kind of reply that doesn't fade. There's a moment Brian still revisits sometimes in his memory. Freddie at the piano, head tilted slightly, eyes locked on keys for a split second before looking up at the crowd. That tiny pause between precision and performance tells the whole story. Because in that fraction of a second, you can see both sides of him. The disciplined musician and the untouchable showman, they were never separate, they were synchronized. The early studio comment could have lingered, could have become a narrative repeated by critics and amplified by lazy assumptions. But Freddie didn't allow that. He transformed every doubt into fuel, every whisper into momentum. And Brian eventually understood something profound. Freddie wasn't trying to be respected by purists. He was trying to be unforgettable. That requires more than scales and theory. It requires nerve, vision, control, and the courage to stand at a piano in front of thousands and make complexity feel effortless. The visiting pianist had evaluated Freddie by traditional standards. Freddie changed the standards. And when someone changes the standard, you don't argue. You adapt or you fall silent. Freddie Mercury wasn't just a showman, wasn't just a frontman, wasn't just a pianist. He was a composer who understood theater, a pianist who understood drama, a performer who understood structure. And that combination made him rare. Maybe that's why this story still resonates. Because somewhere, everyone has been underestimated. Everyone has been labeled too quickly. Everyone has been placed into a category that didn't quite fit.